Hello, everyone. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started in here. You are in practical pollinator support for Kentucky farms. I'm Mad, I'm with Oak, and excited that you all have joined us today for this session. You probably already know, but if you're an extension agent, you can register for CEUs at the registration table at the front. And you know this by now as well. We'll have a survey for you partway through the session here. And I am very pleased to introduce Alexis Gauger, who is from the University of Kentucky. She's a PhD student, and we're very excited to have her today. There will be a Q&A at the end. We'll leave about 10 minutes for that, and maybe a little audience questions sprinkled throughout. There is a resource list as well, so if you don't have that, Katie can bring you one. And we'll go ahead and get started.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today in this afternoon slump, but I hope that we can get excited about pollinators now. Again, this is practical pollinator support for your farm. If you were looking for a different session, you might want to try another room, or you're welcome to just stay here. We have a pretty thick resource packet that we're going to be using throughout, so again, just raise your hand if you don't have that. You're going to want it to refer to during the session, and we're going to do some activities from it as well. Please feel welcome to ask any topical and clarifying questions during the presentation, and just raise your hand and I will get to you as soon as I can. I know that there's also a wealth of knowledge about and experience in this room with regard to pollinator support practices, tips and tricks, and things that you've tried and experiences. I'm super excited about that, but I want to ask that we save suggestions and ideas for the end because we'll have some dedicated time to Skillshare and pull our knowledge and resources. The goal today is not to go super in-depth on methods for implementation and techniques for any of these things, but more so to provide a framework for assessing your assets and your needs, and then making decisions about what techniques are going to be the best fit for your particular farm or situation. And everything included is just my best suggestion based on the research that I've done to compile here for you. But every farm is so unique, and you know yours best. So if I say something and you think, like, that's a dumb idea, I tried that and it didn't work, you're right, it didn't work for you. And there might be things that I don't suggest that did work really well for you. So this is just my best suggestion, but your experience is going to be very valuable as well. So I want to start with I want to start by introducing myself. My name's Lexi Gauger. I grew up on a family hobby farm in Cincinnati, Ohio. We didn't sell for produce for our livelihood, but I got a lot of experience with taking care of living things and the work that involves. And so I studied sustainable ag as an undergraduate at UK, and I'm currently working on my PhD in entomology at the University of Kentucky, and I'm studying sort of the trade-offs between crop yield, pollinator health, and pollinator support, and how to really refine those dynamics for the best outcomes for pollinators and for farmers. But I want to start with some voting. We're going to raise our hands to the right, or point to the right of the room for more, and we're going to point to the left of the room for less. So do you see more or less fireflies now than when you were a kid? This is a very strong vote for less. When you're driving and bugs are hitting your windshield as you're going down the road, does this happen more or less than when you were a kid? Another strong vote for less. And then do you see more or less monarch butterflies this year than when you were a kid? A very strong vote for less. So as you all have observed and scientists have started taking notice of, we are experiencing some global decline in insect populations and insect diversity around the entire globe, including here. Scientists estimate that the annual population of all insects shrinks by around 1 to 2% each year. So you can imagine that over a decade, that results in a pretty major loss. That's a really rapid rate of decline. And in addition to there just being fewer of them, we also have some rare species that are going extinct, things that need really specialized habitat. They're not able to find it anymore, and so they're dying out. But it's not bad for all of the insects. Our pest species are becoming a lot more common. So there's more mosquitoes, there's more corn earworms, weevils, stuff like that. These conditions are great for those and really bad for some of the things that we rely on to help us out. So we need insect allies on farms, as you all know. We're here to talk about pollinators, but these practices are also going to help support our other insect allies, like decomposers. You all care a lot about your soil and put a lot of work into taking care of it, and these guys are helping you do that by breaking down organic matter, providing aeration, etc. You also put a lot of work into pest control on your farm, and these natural enemies are your allies in taking care of that. So the practices that I'm going to talk about are also going to benefit these. But of course, it is a pollinator session. I'm going to mostly refer to bees throughout the session, but more than just bees or pollinators, wasps, butterflies, and moths, beetles, and flies, all of these things also provide pollination services. And the information is going to be relevant to them as well. So pollination is obviously a relationship between a plant and a bee, and this is a really evolutionarily old relationship and very specialized. Plants like it because it gives them the opportunity to get diverse genes when they're reproducing, and bees like it because they eat nectar and pollen. And then humans said, I would like some of the fruits, vegetables, and seeds that come from this relationship, please. And so we are really modifying the context that this entire ancient relationship happens in. Because we've so heavily modified the environment that it's happening in. And so what we can do on our farms and what we can learn in this session is how to modify that in a more positive way rather than in a negative way. A common question that I get is about how you know that you need some pollinator conservation practices on your farm. So that's what the mini needs inventory on the first page is for, the interests and goals section. So some things that might give you a cue that you need some pollinator conservation on your farm are observing low diversity and quantity of insects, wanting to see more natural beauty, wanting more habitat for wildlife, having a yield limitation due to pollination, or just because you want to. I think that's an equally valid reason. And we get so caught up in working for the farm that this is a way that the farm can work for us if these practices work for you and are fulfilling for you. A little bit more on yield limitation. These are some of the crops in Kentucky that are most dependent on pollination. That's going to be our cucurbits, native fruits like pawpaws and maypops, cane fruits, orchard fruits, especially apples, pears, and stone fruits, and things like blueberries. And there are a lot of factors that limit crop yield, as we all know, and lack of pollination is just one of them. But it is demonstrated to be a limiting factor in worldwide crop yields. And you can close about 25% of your yield gap by improving pollination. So it's a relatively small percentage, but it can make a big difference when rounded up to your entire farm. Some crops are also not dependent, or we're going to talk about seed production first, for things that are not pollinator dependent to produce a crop for you to sell. If you ever want to collect seeds, or if you are a seed grower, you're going to need pollination to take care of that as well. And then some crops are not dependent on pollination to make a fruit, but the fruit quality and quantity improves with pollination. So these are some examples of yield limitation due to pollination. When a tomato isn't pollinated enough, it causes cat facing. Strawberries look all deformed and shrunken and small. And then in cucurbit crops, this causes fruit abortion, where the fruit will just die off and not make a sellable fruit. So if you're trying to figure out if you have a pollination deficit on your farm, seeing some of these errors is going to be a good cue for you. And then the second factor of this inventory on the first page of your packet is working within your system. The techniques are not going to work if they don't work within your production system. So some things to think about are land area that a technique would take up, the cost, the time and labor that it takes, if you need new equipment or if you can use the existing equipment that you have, if you need an extra income stream from this, how important pest control is, and how important weed management is on your farm. We're going to switch now to the second page, the mini habitat inventory through the eyes of a bee. I think a really useful way to understand pollinator enhancement methods is to understand the landscape through the eyes of a bee. So foraging resources are normally the first thing that we think about when we think about what bees need. It's flowers. And this is true. Throughout research, there is a really consistent pattern that more diversity and quantity of flowers correlates with more diversity and quantity of bees. And there are a variety of places that they can get foraging resources from on a crop landscape, like flowering crop species on your farm. So having more flowering crops on your farm is going to improve your score. You can go ahead and fill this out as we go through this as well. Bees also need semi-natural habitat areas, which is a group term for things like woodlands, pastures, and fields, and wetlands. Those sites provide a lot of resources for pollinators. Even if they might not seem like they have the most flowers, it provides a lot of the other things that complement the resources that they need. So having more of that on your farm and surrounding your farm is going to be beneficial and boost your score again. Then if you have any existing pollinator support features like a hedgerow or a meadow of native plants, that's another resource that they're able to use as they're jumping around this landscape. And finally, native flowering plant species are also going to be helpful, especially for our native bee species. So this is the landscape over space. We also, one last thing. It can be difficult for pollinators to fly between all of these different places. It's kind of like us trying to cross a busy road. It's a sort of hostile environment and it's hard for them to cross, so it's easier to cross at a crosswalk. For pollinators, that's where these red arrows come in. Things that form a line on your landscape are like a highway for your pollinators and other insect allies to move along. So if you can connect the beneficial features with a little highway for them, that's going to be really beneficial. So this is what the landscape looks like over space. Next, we're going to see what it looks like over time, because things are not flowering all at the same time. So we're going to need resources during the spring, and maybe they find them here. But then where things are flowering during the summer is going to be a different location. So they need to be able to access both of those areas in order to stay fed through the spring and the summer. And then the fall might be in yet another location. So as much as you can combine these over time in a small area, that's going to be more advantageous because they don't have to work as hard to find their resources. But otherwise, knowing the sort of bloom cycle of things on your farm is going to help you out. There are also resources that might be present and then disappear. So if a nesting habitat like this bare field in the lower right corner is tilled, now that's not a resource anymore for ground nesting bees. Or if there's a natural area and then you build this homestead and utility building on it, that's no longer a resource either. So note down the stability of these resources over time and how much the site is changing. The next thing we're going to look at is nesting habitat. So areas of bare ground or sparse vegetation are beneficial for ground nesting bees, which we'll also talk a little bit more about later. So you can mark down how much of that resource bees might be able to find on your farm or your immediate area. They can also use things like dead wood, brush piles, rock walls, and stuff like that, little things that form cavities and crevices for them to nest in. And then a lot of bee species also need shrubs, grasses, and woody plants where the stalks are left over through the winter. So again, like with the tillage, if it's going to be mowed down, then it's going to be a resource temporarily and not later. So that makes this landscape unpredictable for them. And then, on tillage again, if an area is tilled or mowed down, Now that's not a resource. And finally, we're going to look at risk factors. So you have this whole landscape full of assets that are beneficial to pollinators and insect allies on your farm and in the surrounding landscape. But we know that there are also risks that might make these resources into hazards. So on-farm insecticide use is the first category you've got. If you have a flowering crop on your farm, but then you spray insecticides on it, now that's no longer a beneficial resource. Same thing for off-farm or use of fungicides, herbicides, and most other agrochemical products can also cause harm to pollinators. So that will poison and reduce the quality of that resource. And then the insecticide use can also drift into natural areas. So just because it wasn't applied directly to a natural area doesn't mean it's not present. So with those risk factors on the landscape, suddenly it looks a lot less friendly. Yeah, so hopefully you filled out your inventory because we're going to use that later. Or actually, we're going to take 3 minutes now to fill out our inventory, and then we're going to talk about it. So take your time. Yes. Please raise your hand if you need a copy. And as you're finishing that up, remember this is pretty subjective, so just answer to the best of your ability. It's not meant to be a hard and fast rule, it's just meant to give you an idea of where your strengths and vulnerabilities are for bees in your landscape. And I would like it if you would talk to your neighbor for a couple minutes about what you've learned through doing this inventory about the features in your landscape. So we'll take like 2 minutes to talk to our neighbors about what we learned. Okay, thanks for doing that, y'all. We are gonna come back to order, please. And could a couple people report back to share what you learned or observed about your particular assets and vulnerabilities through doing this activity and comparing it with your neighbors? What are some things we noticed? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, paying attention to seasonality of what's blooming. And I like that you said that because we often are paying a lot of attention to the things that are negative for pollinators on our farms, but we should be paying more attention to the assets that we already have as well, so the wildflowers that are there. Anyone else want to report back? Okay. We are going to move on. Well, actually, we're going to go to the next page in your resource packet, which is this scorecard about the different methods that you can use for pollinator support. I've grouped them into 3 categories, and we're going to go through those categories one by one. But for all of them, you're going to use this first inventory exercise to consider your assets and needs, and then be able to choose pollinator support options that fit within those assets and needs. So I've got them broken down by whether the technique is annual or perennial, if it has to be replaced every year, or if it's going to sustain itself year after year, the types of production systems it works best with, the amount of land area that is required. So we've got low, medium, and high. The amount of cost that is required for both startup and maintenance, low, medium, and high. And then the amount of labor that is required for startup and maintenance, low, medium, and high. And then for each of these, I've also given them a score of effectiveness for pollinator support based on the best synthesis of the research articles that I could get. Again, if it works on your farm, then it works on your farm. And just because a particular study doesn't say that doesn't mean it doesn't work. So this score of effectiveness is going to help you decide if you are getting your money's worth out of this practice. I think I did something wrong. There we go. I skipped a slide, sorry. We know As farmers, you all do a lot of jobs, so you need your pollinator support practices to do a lot of jobs too. That's why I've also given you an indicator of the effect on crop yield that each of these practices is going to have, and a list of some of the multifunctional benefits that a practice could create. Some of them include benefiting other insect allies, our pest controllers, and our decomposers, benefiting wildlife, providing another income stream, benefiting soil health, and more. And then I've also given you management considerations for things that might make this work better or worse within your production system. With that, we're going to jump into techniques. So our first category is low barrier to entry methods. These are going to be pretty low risk, low to medium reward, but are a great place to start if you just want to do something free or experiment with something. My first suggestion is to just leave unharvested crops to bolt. We all have areas of the field that we didn't get to before the bugs did, or we just didn't have the market to harvest them. So for some of those, you can just let them go to flower, and that's going to provide some temporary in-field resources for your pollinators. Some good things to do that with are like most of your brassica crops and lettuces, as well as if you have any extra onions or herbs, they love those. So this is a really free, labor-saving method that you can try out. You will want to watch out for if this causes an explosion of pests or weeds in your field, and then that might not be worth the trade-off. And then the management for terminating it could be a little bit tricky. So you want to remove it after peak flowering is over so that it gives your bees the most benefit, but before setting seed if you don't want this to become a weed in your field. My next suggestion is to leave some non-crop areas unmowed. So a lot of us have some extra empty fields of just grass on our farms, and we spend a lot of time mowing it. And the seed bank in those areas might contain some native grasses and wildflowers that would be very beneficial for pollinators. It also, your quality will vary based on the seed bank, but even grasses and flowering weeds can be beneficial and provide some resources to pollinators and natural enemies. So there's a syrphid fly and a little beetle eating some grass pollen on the slide. So even though it's not what we typically think of as a pollinator plant, it might still be able to provide some resources. And then this also is beneficial because it provides permanent habitat. So this resource isn't jumping around the landscape over time, it's staying in one place and it's providing some benefits. One major consideration is you've got to watch out for invasive grasses and agricultural weeds. They could take over this area, so you want to prevent that. You might also want to consider if you want to use this area recreationally, you might not want it in such tall grass. It might provide some tick habitat, so watch out for that. And if your neighbors really don't like how it looks, then maybe it's not worth getting into a fight with your neighbors. But if you want to save some time mowing, save some time on the tractor, then you can try this out. And then finally, providing nesting habitat and water. This is a really often overlooked element of the needs of bees in our landscapes because we're mostly just thinking about flowers, but they also need a place to raise their babies and have a home. A great deal of our native bees are ground nesting solitary bees. They dig underground tunnels to lay eggs. They'll lay their little eggs and give it some pollen, and then they will develop and turn into a little pollinator for us. Squash bees are an example of this that we see a lot in this area and that are super beneficial for our crop yield. There are also burrow nesting bees like bumblebees that use underground holes like rodent burrows to make their homes. And so to provide some space for bees that nest in the ground, you can minimize tillage so that they can use the soil area. If it's tilled deeply past about like 3 inches, it's going to kill most of the ground nesting bees. So as much as is feasible, reducing that allows that to remain a habitat for them. You can just not fill in rodent holes as long as you're not going to trip and break an ankle in it. If you have really patchy areas of grass, like on these pictures, you could spend a lot of time and money on grass seed and covering it with straw to try to grow it back, or you can just leave it if you want some habitat for ground nesting bees. And then if you want to get really extra about it, you can also build soil mounds, and these have been shown to like substantially improve the populations of ground nesting bees in agricultural fields. But it's probably easier to just leave some areas uncovered. We also have cavity nesting bees that lay their eggs in the stalks or stems of pithy types of plants and grasses. So they'll provide a pollen ball like you see in the middle of this picture here and lay their egg on it, and then the egg turns into a larva as it eats the pollen, and eventually that turns into a bee. And our native mason bees, orchard bees, and leafcutter bees all nest in this way. So to help provide some nesting habitat for them, you can leave plant stems until spring from things that have a sort of pithy stem, as long as you can tolerate it staying in your garden and don't need to remove it for appearances. You can also find some logs in the woods that already have some holes in it and just drop those around your site. And then building bee hotels is an idea that has become popular recently. These are pretty fun because it's a sort of craft project that you can do with kids or with volunteers on the farm to teach them about native bees. Their efficacy, not super great, but there's not really any harm in doing it if you enjoy it. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. You can just drill some holes into a scrap block of wood, or you can put some reed straws into some sort of container to provide some nesting habitat. And some miscellaneous options: give water with a bee bowl. It might be fun. This is not going to be a super major benefit to pollinators in your yard, but it might be fun to watch them use it. You can leave the leaves by just leaving areas of fallen leaves unraked. And then my favorite is the idea of building a bug snug, which is basically just a brush pile that you're going to shove into a more attractive appearance. And your stem nesting bees are going to be living in there, and it's also great shelter for other beneficial insects, especially ground beetles, who are decomposers. So the consensus on this is that I've given it 3 flowers because it provides some resources that are often hard to find and might be limiting, but it's not a super big like ecosystem level change. Okay. Moving on to things that require a little bit more work but are integrated into your existing production methods. The first thing we're going to talk about is insectary strips. Insectary is just a home for insects, and these are going to be flowers, foraging resources. You can do this in an annual or perennial system, and these are great because you can plant them in underutilized margins or underproductive areas of the fields, or like I've done in this picture, in awkward row ends. In the top picture, we had just some extra planting holes that were left open when we were using the water reel. And so I just dropped some tithonia in and got all of these bugs on it throughout the season. These facilitate pollinator movement into the field. So they're very bright and showy and attractive. That's going to draw the bugs from the surrounding landscape to your crop field. And then as they are drawn into your crop field, they're going to move through and pollinate the crop as well. So it can provide a modest boost to crop pollination. Some suggestions for crops to do this with an annual version are sunflowers, tithonias, zinnias, cornflowers, cosmos, borage, gomphrena, celosia, strawflower, and any herbs. They really like herb flowers. A major pro of this is that your field prep is already done because it's within a field that you were already planning on planting. And the seeds for these flowers are often pretty accessible and inexpensive. You can often get them for cheap or for free as like a little bonus with your seed order. And they establish pretty easily. And you can harvest some cut flowers for yourself if you just want to enjoy them. And then the cons are that you have to work your equipment around it temporarily while it's in the field and avoid insecticide drift and that sort of thing. So you do have to pay attention to it while you're managing. And they could become self-seeding and become a weed if that's not desirable. And it could be difficult to prevent that because the bloom time is going to be staggered throughout the year. So if it's feasible for you to chop individual heads as they go to seed, that's probably the only way that you're going to prevent any seed set. So if that's a major no-no, then you probably don't want to do this. You can also do this with perennial plants, like seen in these examples from New Hampshire, I think, where there's just a strip next to a crop field, so it's easy to work equipment around it because it's basically part of the field, or a small area taken out of production. The pros of this is that there's minimal maintenance. Native plants don't require a lot of work to establish and to keep happy year after year, so you're not going to have to irrigate this or anything. And it provides that constant year-over-year habitat and food resource. So rather than being here one year and there the next, the bees and other insects know exactly where to go because it's always there. And it will also help, if you're using native plants, it will help support some native insects as well. The cons are that it's a little bit more expensive and labor intensive to establish because native transplants are a little bit more expensive. You have to work your equipment around it permanently, so you've got to choose a site that is going to be manageable for that. And sometimes they can spread through rhizomes or shoots over time, but not as much of an issue with weediness. Prairie strips are just a giant version of an insectary, basically, and these were developed for use in row crop production because row crop farmers were having a lot of issues with erosion and nutrient loss due to runoff. So these are based on the idea of a contour buffer, but just with added native flowering plants. Again, they're integrated into row crop fields. This is probably most relevant for Western Kentucky farmers, but there's no reason why you couldn't put a prairie strip on any kind of farm if you would like to. For siting these, it's a great opportunity to locate them in underproductive areas, like this side of a hill. That was going to be a pain to work equipment over anyways, so you may as well take it out and put it into prairie strip. The images on the bottom show the location of prairie strips on some different farms in Minnesota and Iowa. So you can see there's all different ways to locate them and install them. Some people do it along contour lines, and that's going to provide the maximum protection from erosion and nutrient runoff. Some people do them just along the borders of the field because that's easier and that's still going to catch a lot of your runoff. And then you want to space them in a way that works with your equipment needs. So put the spacing between them to be like 2 or 3 passes, an even number of equipment passes for whatever you're going to need to work through there. You can drive on them though and use them as like a turnaround spot. We're not going to go super in-depth into establishment, but in your resource packet, there are in-depth explanations. There are sources to find in-depth explanations for every stage of these. So ground prep, I think we're going to go over when we talk about native plants later, but you'll have to do some site prep with the option of planting a nurse crop to help establishment, and then you seed with native grasses and forbs, which are flowering plants in the spring or the fall. And for the first couple years, you're going to want to mow to keep the height at 4 to 6 inches. And then maintenance involves just spot mowing and spraying to control weeds, because this is also a great habitat for thistle or Johnson grass or things like that. So you want to keep an eye out for those. And then every 2 to 4 years, they have to be mowed or burned. Native prairie plants evolved with fire, so they benefit from being burned every couple of years. That it can be expensive, and it's a very different skill set to be working on. Thank you. So you want to take that into consideration if that management is feasible. We're going to run through this now. Next option is incorporating flower and cover crops into any areas that you're using cover crops currently. You can mix a couple species into a full field that is in fallow, or you can incorporate cover crops into furrows between crops and into bare areas in your fields. This is also usable in orchards and vineyards, and also works with livestock integration. So I've also included a link to information about grazing livestock on flower and cover crops. So that's an option as well. The types of species that you're going to want to choose are going to depend on your goals and the particular site. So the Xerces Society provided a table that shows some good options for each different type of goal that you might have with your cover crops. And you're going to want to use your existing cover crops knowledge to integrate flowering cover crops successfully. So you're going to need to consider different seeding rates and depths for all the different species, whether you want to use a nurse crop, the different shapes and heights of the plants in the mixture, the timing, and being able to combine soil health benefits and maximize biomass. As far as the relationship with pollination and crop yield, these are beneficial because they provide a good quantity of food resources for pollinators, and it's integrated right into your field. They kind of lose a point for being relatively low diversity. But large areas of mass flowering crops, like the mustard field in the top right corner, that can be a distraction to bees like honeybees and bumblebees. So if you are planting a crop that requires pollination from those insects specifically, like a tomato field or something like that, you might not want to site this large mustard field right next to it. But they don't distract our native and solitary bees, so you don't have to worry about that. And then when you're integrating them into your crop field and planting only small areas, that will again help facilitate pollinators to pollinate your crop. And this is something that my research is kind of looking into, and I found that having just a couple flowering species is enough. So like having 2 flowering species in your mixture is as good as having 8. So there's no point in buying the extra 6 types of seed. You can just get away with a couple. Let's get that. My final suggestion for production methods is to optimize your production practices to minimize harm. And unfortunately for time, I'm just going to skip through this, sorry. Okay, final category is ecosystem level enhancements. And these are things that are going to be permanent. It's a much higher investment, but you're going to get a lot more reward out of this, and it's going to benefit the entire surrounding landscape. So if you think back to the landscape through the eyes of the bees, this is going to benefit things in your entire surrounding area. So one option is hedgerows. This is kind of a lost art in the United States. We never really had a lot of these to begin with, but these are going to be linear elements of trees and shrubs that were historically used as fences to mark property lines, but these can provide a huge quantity of resources if they're flowering, including pollen and nectar. They also give you benefits of being a windbreak, providing shade so you can go rest next to the hedgerow while you're working, shelter for insects, provisioning, in that you can sometimes harvest berries or firewood from it. They also capture water and carbon. So if you use attractive flowering trees and shrubs, this is going to be a resource for pollinators. And then locating them near crop fields, you've got to be careful about overspray. Some species suggestions for this, I've got trees for a very tall one that's not really going to be a fence. And then shrubs are going to form more of a fence and a barrier that you have to work equipment around. You can also use non-attractive hedgerows as a barrier for insecticide drift. If you are downwind of a lot of conventional farms, you can use multiple layers of evergreen trees like spruce, juniper, and fir to help block insecticide drift as it is coming in the wind across your farm. And by using evergreen trees, these are not attractive to pollinators and to most of our other beneficial insect allies. So they will naturally not be attracted to this as it catches the insecticide drift. Native plant meadows are probably the thing that is of most interest to talk about. On a small scale, I'm going to show you what I've done in my own front yard, and then we're going to talk about large scale options. On a small scale, site prep involves sod removal and cardboard sheet mulching, and I've had good success with a wood chip mulch. You plant in early spring or late fall and choose plants for the right site conditions. There's resources to help make those decisions in the resource packet. And you're going to want to mark the site because it's not going to look like much for a while, so you don't want to step on it or mow over it. With native plants, there's a saying that says in the first year they sleep, in the second year they leap, or they creep, and in the third year they leap. So this is what one of those small plantings looks like in year one. I circled the plants because you can't hardly even see them. In year 2, I was super proud of this and thought that it looked amazing. And in year 3, it's just exploded. It's much bigger. There's a lot more biomass. Same thing. You can't even see them. I thought it looked so good. And then in subsequent years, years 2 and 3, the biomass is going to explode. So basically, if you plant it and it doesn't look like much, don't freak out. On a larger scale, you're going to have to do things a little differently because the small scale adoption method just isn't feasible for anything above maybe 1/4 of an acre. So choose a site that is away from any agrochemical drift on your property, and then it's a lot easier to establish a pollinator meadow from an existing crop field because the site prep is going to be easier if it's already cultivated and already free of weeds and grass, but you can do it from grass as well. There are lots of options for site prep. I think the one that gets the best reviews is usually solarization, but repeated shallow cultivation can help as well. If you're starting from grass, though, you're probably going to need to do a full soil inversion with like a mold board plow. And there's a really detailed resource on choosing your site prep method and comparing the site prep methods as well as cost estimates in the resource packet. You have 2 options for establishing these, from seeds or from transplants. If you're establishing from seed, you're going to want to choose a mix that is adapted to your local region and to your site. And a good percentage to go for is 25 to 50% grasses, and then 75 to 50% forbs, which are going to be the flowering plants. And you want to prep the site in a way that is going to maximize seed-soil contact. So some cultivation might be best. And you're going to sow these between November and February, so in the winter. You can broadcast them by hand for smaller areas. It helps to mix it with another substrate to help you spread it out. There are also native seed drills available to rent at some conservation districts and from some other resources. These are specially designed to sow at different depths for the particular species. So the pro of this is that it requires less specific site prep, but that is going to be an expense to rent it or to contract that out. You can also establish larger areas from transplants. These transplants can be pretty expensive, from like $4 to $12 a plant, so that adds up. But it's a much better guarantee of successful establishment to use transplants. And it also ensures that you get your favorites and lets you lay them out into a specific design so that you get your specific vision. You're going to plant these by hand in the fall or in the early spring, or with a water wheel. Never seen anyone do that, but I don't see why not. As far as maintenance goes, you're not going to expect it to look like very much until around year 3. And then there's going to be mowing involved for maintenance. And once it's established, by year 3 or 4, you're going to have to, every 3 to 5 years, mow, hay, or burn the field. And ideally, only do about 1/3 to 1/2 of this at a time so that the whole thing isn't being maintained at the same time. And you're also going to want to keep an eye out for any tall and woody weeds. My final suggestion before we move on to like skill sharing is to manage existing habitat resources on your farm. If you're lucky enough to have forests, fields, and streams on farm, these are incredible resources because this natural habitat is the single thing that has the best, most positive outcomes for pollinators and for beneficial insects on your farm. A lot of our Kentucky forests, unfortunately, are super invaded with honeysuckle. You can see a before and after of honeysuckle invasion at the top of the screen. Management for this involves primarily removing invasive species. This is super expensive and super labor intensive, as anyone who's done it can tell you. But once you've done that, you can replant with native and edible plants to have a beautiful forest that meets like your heart's desires and also provides good resources for insects. If there's any water sources on your farm, the area immediately around that is called a riparian zone. And it's important for filtering water, and it also provides lots of resources to the insects on your farm. To manage this, I would recommend removing invasive species first, limiting animal access and heavy traffic so that the ground is not being disturbed and torn up as much. And then you can replant with native trees, shrubs, and grasses. On the left is an example from the Kentucky Horse Park. And on the right is a site right next to the Kentucky River that is a little bit more established and mature. And then finally, a lot of Kentucky, especially central Kentucky, is historically an oak savanna habitat, which is a big field with a few oak trees in it. And these are really beautiful habitats, as you can see by the pictures, but they're kind of imperiled. So if you're lucky enough to have some of these left on your farm, I would recommend removing invasive species, and especially keeping an eye out for agricultural weeds. And then you can interseed with native species and manage with prescribed burns and mowings. Again, there's a detailed explanation for each of these in the resource packet. Some things that are not recommended for a conservation strategy would be importing bumblebees or native solitary bees. You can buy these on the internet now, but they can spread diseases, so I wouldn't recommend that. Getting honeybee hives as a conservation strategy. The bees that you're trying to conserve are not the honeybees, they're the native bees, and the honeybees can outcompete them. If it's a honey strategy, though, that's a great strategy, so don't be discouraged. And then exotic ornamental gardens as a conservation strategy don't provide a lot of value. But if you really like them, then that's great. You should go for it. And then I don't recommend perfectionism with your pollinator support practices or as a life strategy in general. Finally, how do you assess your success? My first recommendation would be to redo this habitat inventory. That way you can keep track of how the assets and vulnerabilities are changing over time and what areas you might have made some improvements and what areas there are still some deficits. There's also a scouting guide included in the resource packet for how to watch for and more accurately count the number of types of native bees on your farm. But scouting doesn't have to be that technical. As long as you write it down, you have recorded and assessed your success. You can check on your yields and income and see if you've overcome some of the pollination deficits we talked about earlier, and if you're getting an income boost from higher yields. But most importantly, does it work? Assess, does it work for you? Is it working within your lifestyle and your production system? And if not, then don't do it. And make sure to take time to enjoy it so that it's working for you. I'm going to wrap up with a quote. I couldn't find an attribution for it, but your garden is your vote for the kind of world you want to live in. And we are often in very sort of stressful, dangerous times, but this is a way that you can exert control over what you have control over and make a massive positive difference within the limits of what you can do. So with that, I will take questions, and I would also like to open the floor for people to share practices and tips and tricks that have worked for them. So questions and comments.
I know you skipped over a part that dealing with BT, Bacillus thuringiensis,
Yes.
That's been engineered into certain crops. What is that doing to any of our pollinator species?
Yeah. BT is a lower risk insecticide for bees. It's target specific, so it doesn't affect bees. The specific strain you choose is going to only affect flies or only affect moths.
Moths, yeah.
So it's a much lower risk option for bees. However, right, for butterflies and moths on the farm, that could also be harmful for them. So that's why there was an asterisk next to it.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
How many of the ground nesting bees are nasty if you happen to be mowing your lawn and you step on them and they come up and sting you? I mean, I've had that trouble at least twice in my yard. And are there other ground nesting bees that won't sting you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So most of our native solitary bees that nest in just small holes in the ground are not stinging or very rarely sting, or their sting isn't harmful to humans. The main ground nesting stinging insects you have to worry about are bumblebees and then wasps. But I think this is a great example of making your practices work within your production system. If it is a risk to you every time you drive over that area of ground that has holes in it to get stung, then that method doesn't work for you, so you can fill in those holes. So. Yeah, I'm not sure about like what specific species it might be, but there are a lot of small solitary ground nesting bees. So, and there's a resource in the packet about identifying some of your native bees as well.
Hi, could you go back to that slide you skipped over the different pesticide toxicity? I was curious to read over that information.
Yes, I apologize for needing to go through it. I obviously put too much information in, but the slides will also be available after the conference on the Oak website, and the complete resource packet will also be made available. There you go. Any other questions or suggestions for things that some of your neighbors might want to try?
Would you be able to talk about fungicides a little bit? I know some of our copper-based fungicides have shown to have some toxicity towards at least honeybees, for example, and their brood viability. Do we also see that in native species of bees?
Yes, so I'll go back to this since apparently I shouldn't have skipped it. But as far as testing for insecticide risks to bees goes, organic insecticides are not necessarily safe just because they're considered lower risk, although it is a better option. These products are only tested for causing lethality to honeybees, so they're only considered toxic if it kills a honeybee within like 3 days of exposure. But there are a lot of sublethal effects that can happen that are going to over time cause harm, eventually cause death, and reduce your populations across your site. And the products are not tested on native bees, and a lot of times native bees are more sensitive. So I'm not sure about copper specifically. The Xerces Society considers that to be one of the lower risk ones, and there is a resource on the packet about minimizing harm to pollinators from organic insecticide use. But as far as if that product specifically affects native bees, I'm not sure about that. We probably have time for one more question or comment. All right, well, thank you all very much, and feel free to ask any other questions.